Welcome to the S.O.A.P Bible Study video series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We are working our way through the Gospel of Mark, and we have come to chapters 7 and 8.
Right.
And just pushing our way through along with Mark.
Yeah, exactly. Because Mark's
what he
going
does.
Yeah. Yeah, so we see that Mark continues to move so quick from event to event.
Yeah.
And we still see that Jesus is being shown as a servant through here. You know, he's doing his master's work and he's moving on to the next thing.
Yeah.
And I think it was 2 weeks ago we actually saw a change where the Jewish leaders lied and they said that Jesus was healing through the power of Satan.
Yeah.
And then we noticed a shift.
Yeah.
And that shift was he started teaching in parables, especially to the Jewish nation.
Yeah. And those were local Pharisees. Those were from the north, from Galilee, basically, right?
Yeah. And now we'll see a difference this week where the national guys come into play.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we see it right off the bat, right? So we see it in chapter 7. The Pharisees and the experts in the law were from Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So now you have Jesus getting national attention, which is usually a good thing, but not so much in this case.
Yeah.
And it seems like Jesus is a little short with them, but I think the whole reasoning is these guys did not come to see who he was. That decision has already been made.
Yeah.
They came to try to trap him.
Yeah. 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 And he quotes again from Isaiah. This is a big thing from Isaiah. We see this in the prophet Isaiah a lot. They've honored me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me.
Yeah.
So
that's a great verse, isn't it?
Yeah. Well,
I mean
yes,
it's a terrible verse. You know, to be told about.
They say all the right things, they do all the right things, but there's no heart in it.
Yeah.
Right.
And we see that in churches today too,
Yeah.
right? And we see it in people today where, man, they're saying the right things, but they're not right.
Well, we see that Revelation chapter 2, right? The church at Ephesus.
Yeah.
You know, you're doing all the right stuff, but you've left your first love.
Right.
So don't stop what you're doing. Just start doing it with the right heart again.
Yeah.
And so that's, he just, you reject the commandment of God in order to set up your tradition. He starts,
he starts really getting into it, right?
Yeah.
And he's not wrong by any means, because at this point, and I think still we see where churches take their traditions and elevate them to the same level as the law, or in our case, God's word.
Yeah. Yeah. Culture infiltrates, and as culture goes further away from God, churches, unfortunately tend to follow.
Right. So it's the things that, we've always done it this way, and that you can easily get into. And, one of the things is, what are we doing in our lives today that we think is based on, is biblical, but is just a tradition and something that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe we don't even know why we're doing it, right? It's just, like you said, we've always done it.
Yep.
So so churches tend to take one of two sides. We've always done it this way. I don't care what anybody says. Right. Or it's like, well, everything changes, so we'll just go along with the changes. There's got to be a reason to change.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So Jesus talks about, I love how concise, Mark is. Basically, it doesn't matter what you eat. Doesn't matter what comes inside of you. That's the part that doesn't matter. But what does matter is what comes out of you.
Yeah.
And that's the part that he says that can defile you.
Which I see that as he's starting to drop some breadcrumbs that things are going to be changing.
Yeah.
Right. Because to this point, he's under the law. He's telling them they still have to be under the law. But at the same time, he's like, food doesn't make you unclean. Whoa, hold on a second.
Right.
For 1,400 years, food has made us unclean.
Right. And that wasn't necessarily a tradition, right? I mean, that was
a
law.
Law. Right. So he didn't tell them, go break the law and eat something. But he told them,
like you said, the breadcrumbs.
It's not the food that's doing it. There's something inside. Right.
Yeah.
By the way, Mark adds a little piece of color commentary here in verse 19. He says, this means all foods are clean. And let's not forget, he wrote this after the beginning of the church, after Peter saw his vision of the sheet in Acts chapter 10 and all the different
Kill,
stuff.
eat.
Kill and eat, right. And in fact, in chapter 7, as we were talking, chapter 7, Mark, we've mentioned that Mark is writing to a Roman or a Gentile audience, right? Chapter 7, we see some of these little drops where Mark has to explain what's going on because he assumes
just to
his
get their
readers.
readers on.
Yep.
So give a couple of those.
Well, one of those is this means that all foods are clean. He's it's color commentary. In verses 3 and 4, he actually takes 2 verses and says, okay, all right, pause. Let's pause the story. You're talking about washed hands and unwashed hands. Here's why this matters. The Pharisees.
Believe that. You got to wash your hands.
Right. Yeah. Everybody got that? Okay, let's pick up the account, right? Yeah. So it's really cool that he does that. And there's a couple other places here in chapter 7 where he brings those out.
Yeah. Also in 7, thing that really stuck out with me, or one of the things that popped out, Jesus gives a long list when he's talking about all food. Anything that comes into you isn't not clean. It's what comes out of you.
Right.
And he gives a list. And that list makes sense, right? He's talking about murder and slander and these bad things that everybody would say, yeah, that's bad. And then he ends with folly.
Yeah.
And you I kind of stopped and was like,
what?
Yeah, exactly. How did that make the list? But if you think about it, as a parent, so I assume God thinks about it similar, which you may or may not. I mean, you want your child to be doing what makes sense and what they were made for. And folly isn't that.
Folly is the exact opposite of
right.
that, right?
Folly is them going off on their own, just trying stuff out.
Yeah.
So you can see where that would be on a list of bad things, but he's putting it at the same level as sexual misconduct and murder and theft.
Yeah.
It's like, wow.
Well, and it's right after pride too, and it's really where folly comes from, right? Yeah. Folly is this this intentional, willful foolishness. I'm going to do exactly what I'm not supposed to do,
right?
And it's sort of like the result comes out of pride, right?
Yeah,
yeah.
Good. So in chapter 7, Jesus is on the move again, and we've talked about it a number of times, and it's kind of hard keeping up with him where he's at, because sometimes they don't give you a lot of clues.
Yeah.
But he was around the Sea of Galilee, and he was going from side to side, and you could kind of trace him. Now he takes a hop onto the Mediterranean,
yeah,
and he's up. I guess it would be northwest, up on the Mediterranean Sea in a city that seems to be mostly non-Jewish, right? Mostly Gentiles, if not all Gentiles.
Tyre, Sidon area, modern day Lebanon, okay, north of Israel, and the Net Bible calls it a Syro-Phoenician woman.
Yeah, which is like, wow.
Yeah, well, it's an old name because you got Syria and Phoenicia and in that whole area. So Matthew just calls her Canaanite, which is interesting. A Canaanite woman.
Nice. So he heals this woman's child that had a demon in it, right? Mm-hmm. And then heals a deaf person with a speech issue, and then he's on the move again, and he's back to the Sea of Galilee.
Yep.
So why was he up there, and what was the purpose?
Well, again, we've got now at the beginning of chapter 7, we've got the national Pharisees from Jerusalem that are actually coming at him. Right. They traveled from Jerusalem up north to attack him,
which is quite a trip.
Yeah. So he's gonna start staying away. He's not going to enter their jurisdiction unless he has good reason to, because as he says in some other gospels, it's not my time. It is coming, but there's no reason to push it.
Right.
There's other things he can do. So.
Okay, so then in chapter 8, we see that he feeds 4,000. Mm-hmm. Now, previous he's fed 5,000, and that 5,000 was primarily Jewish. Mm-hmm. This 4,000 is primarily Gentile.
Yeah.
Right? So like you said, he's probably still trying to stay away from the national.
And he's I'm not going to say he's shifting his ministry toward Gentiles, but he definitely seems to be more inclusive than early on. As Israel is rejecting him, he's opening more and more.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, now, there are some people, and it's just fun fact, there are some people who say, well, the 5,000 and the 4,000 were really the same event.
Right.
And the gospel writers needed to embellish the legend of Jesus a little bit more, so they changed a few details and they put it in there twice. We're going to see in a moment why I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
Right?
I assume that's when Jesus says, "Do you remember the 5,000?
Yeah.
Do you remember the 4,000?"
Yeah, if Jesus remembers two of them, maybe there were actually two of them.
Okay.
Now, I should say here at the beginning of chapter 8, there's nothing in chapter 8 that specifically says these people are Gentile.
Right.
So we have to get that from another place. Matthew's account of the feeding of the 4,000, it ends with, "And they glorified the God of Israel."
Yeah, which they wouldn't.
Which
say.
is really a weird way to say it if they're Jewish people.
Yeah, and you do bring up a good point that I think you wanted to bring up is, we're focusing on Mark, but we have 3 other gospels to go to that we can go to.
Yeah.
Certainly not in Jesus's day while they were around at various times, but where we can get more information.
Yeah,
and
this
it's a useful tool.
Yeah, there are several things in this week's reading that
Or a little vague.
a little vague,
A little short on
just
details.
sort of leave it there, and you're like, well, wait a minute, is there an answer to that? There is. It's just not in Mark.
Yeah. Speaking of which,
Do you have one of those?
Yes, I might. The next one that comes up, the yeast of the Pharisee and the yeast of Herod.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting discussion. So they fed the 4,000. They get into a boat. So Jesus is with his apostles, and he says, "Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod."
Well, now you got to set it up because
Then he goes to sleep.
Right, yeah. But before he says that, though, the disciples remembered,
Right.
we forgot to bring lunch with us. We have no bread for lunch. And Jesus says, be careful of the yeast of the Pharisees.
Right.
And then he
it
takes a
seems
nap.
like he leaves or takes a nap
Yeah.
or whatever.
And they're all like,
what does that mean?
Are we not supposed to buy bread from Pharisees? Is it bad? Are they trying to poison us? What could he possibly mean?
Yeah.
And Mark doesn't tell us.
Yeah.
He just moves on, right?
Right.
So
but
again,
Jesus is frustrated
Yeah.
with them. And he's like, "Guys, really? You're worried about us not having bread? I just fed 5,000.
Right.
How much bread did we have? Yeah, and how much was left?" And then he went through, "Now, I just fed the 4,000. How much how much did we have? How much was left?"
Right.
And there was different numbers in there and different amounts.
Right.
I mean, it was clearly Jesus
Are you,
saying
so number one,
two
are you
different
really
events.
worried that we can't
Yeah,
I can't
and then
take
I-
care of lunch?
Right.
And number two,
And
don't
we're in a
you-
boat and you guys are fishermen.
I can make bread, you can catch fish, we should be good. And then Mark ends this in verse 21 with, do you still not understand? And then he moves on.
Right.
And we're all like, no.
I think I might understand. I don't know if I do.
Matthew
so
actually...
yeast is a clue.
Yeah, Matthew actually expands it with one more verse. It says, then they understood that he was talking about the teaching of the Pharisees, not their food.
Right. So we had found out, the Pharisees have said, and we said this at least twice today so far, the Pharisees have lied and said that Jesus' power came from Satan. Herod said, who is this Jesus guy? He thought it was John the Baptist.
Come back from the dead to haunt him.
Yeah. But if you think of both of those as a lie, and then you think of yeast being a very small thing that has a profound effect on bread, a lie is kind of the same way.
A lie can permeate.
Permeate, and that's where I think he's going with it.
There's an old saying, and I don't remember who said it. Maybe Mark Twain or somebody, G.K. Chesterton. Somebody said that a lie can travel all the way around the world before the truth gets its boots on, and that's the
right.
A great saying. And it just that concept. So don't listen to their teaching. They're going to be attacking us. Don't listen to their teaching.
Right. And even at this point, the apostles saw the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000. They had direct instructions from Jesus. They were still kind of trying to still figure it out.
Yeah.
At this point.
Yeah. Which is
and
really...
Peter does answer the question later.
Yeah. But even still, he... Yeah. Even 2 minutes later, he's still getting it wrong. Even after, well, let's get there. That's at the end of chapter 8 here. So
yeah, so there's an event that takes place that I need help with. I think a lot of people do. They call it a 2-stage healing.
Yeah.
So Jesus kind of seems to take his time, and the guy can't see, so he spits, maybe rubs his eyes, and the guy can see a little bit. He does something else, and the guy can see. And then we move on again. So, the obvious question is, if Jesus is God, why does it take 2 times?
Yeah.
And I'll let you answer that one. It's so easy.
Well, okay. We don't know. That's a good question for to somebody else, right?
Yeah.
We don't. I mean, I don't think we know. I know people give a lot of opinions and speculation, but the first thing we have to remember is that this is the only time in all the gospel records that this actually happens. Every other miracle, every other healing is instantaneous, right? This one is different for some reason, and frankly, Mark doesn't give us enough information,
Right.
at least in my opinion. Others might have a different opinion. What I think is interesting, though, is that if Mark is writing down Peter's recollection, since none of the other Gospels mention this is mentioned only here in Mark, only in like these 4 verses, 5 verses or whatever, it must have had such a profound effect on Peter that he was going around telling people,
that he remembered it,
that he
and
remembered
was relating it.
Yeah, and Mark decided to write it. Matthew didn't include it. Luke didn't include it. John didn't include it.
Right. So from a commentary, so what happens next then, it ends with Peter's confession. So Jesus is saying, hey, who do people say I am? And it's John the Baptist, Elijah, other things. And then it was a specific question, who do you say I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ. So some commentaries say that the healing is representative of the apostles themselves and their learning. That
Multiple
they
stages.
learned it. Yeah, it took them multiple stages to learn. I don't know, right? If that was the case, but it is interesting. What that may be reading too much into it, but what's not is Peter being there, and it does seem to have a profound impact on him.
Yeah. There's just it's just there's not enough information. Yeah.
Well, that's the fun part.
Yeah.
Right.
You got to have some questions that when we get there we can ask.
Yeah. I got
Pick me.
Yeah. On page 87.
Yeah. Right.
Why?
Now, what's interesting is Peter, you are the Christ, and Jesus is like, yeah, you win. And then Jesus shifts gears and says, okay, now I've got to tell you guys something. We're going to Jerusalem. Yeah, we know that. Yeah, Jerusalem. I'm going to be arrested, betrayed, arrested. I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to be, this whole, resurrected, the whole thing. And Peter says, far be it from you. No, you won't. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. And that tends to throw people. Is he calling him Satan? Was Satan doing that? Was Satan didn't Satan possess Peter and all this stuff? I think it's easier than that. If you go back to the temptation, Satan had already tempted Jesus. You can't have the kingdom without having to go through all this. Why don't you just take it? Jesus is saying, we're going down here and I have to go through all this. And Peter says, no, you don't.
Yeah.
He says, you are doing the exact same thing
Nice.
that Satan did. You're trying to offer me something in a way that I'm not supposed to have it.
Right. Yeah, that I can't accept it.
You're setting your mind. You're not setting your mind on God's interests, but on man's interests. So you want the kingdom. You want it now. That's not the way it's going to be. But by standing here, you're actually almost doing. I mean, this is literally devil's advocate. I mean, literally devil's advocate. So
nice. Well, I think that's the end of this week, right?
Yeah, there's going to be one thing. We go into chapter 9, verse 1, but it's a bad break. It actually picks up with next week's reading, so we need to include it with next week. I don't want to. The break happens here, but we're going to have to do it next time.
Okay.
Because it leads into next week's account. So.
All right, good.
So.
All right. Well, good place to stop.
Yeah, so a lot of stuff in this week. I mean, lots of 3 and 4 and 6 verse sections. Right. Just boom, 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 boom. Right. So we obviously didn't hit everything. There's stuff in here that we intentionally skipped. So if you've got questions or there's things that you like, you're like, oh, I wish you would have talked about that. Let us know. Okay, we can always talk about it later, or we just talk to you about it, or email or whatever. But let us know, because there's a lot of cool stuff in here, and let us know what you see. That's really fun. So we are at the end of chapter 8. There's only 16 chapters, so we're halfway through the book. So moving along, and things are going to pick up even faster as we keep going here. So buckle up. We're going to be in for a ride.
Bye, everybody.